Welcome to American History Lesson 13. Changes on the Western Front. Our lesson objectives are: identify the various factors that fueled America's Western expansion, identify key technologies that aided America's Western expansion, identify what economic and political actions strengthened Western expansion, identify how the Western expansion impacted the rest of the United States. The growing conflict of frontier Americans and the Native Americans. The Native Americans who lived on the Great Plains depended on vast herds of buffalo and horses. The buffalo herds provided the Native Americans with food, clothing, and buffalo hides that were made into shelter. Horses were used to corral and hunt buffalo as mounts during wartime and service animals when the clans moved across the Great Plains. The Native Americans lived in family groups called clans, which were ruled by a council of its eldest members. As the Civil War ended, many Americans began looking forward to the Great Plains as a method to build a new life and escape from their current circumstances. Many American settlers moved to Colorado to start gold mining. The Homestead Act was passed to sell cheap land to farmers, and the Homestead Act was responsible for attracting more than 400,000 settlers from 1862 to 1900. Several thousand of these settlers were African Americans moving to escape racial tension, while other settlers were immigrants from Germany and Scandinavia looking for fortune and a new life in America. A problem arose when Native Americans and American settlers came into contact with each other. The American government had previously granted the Great Plains to Native Americans when they removed the Native Americans from the land settled by the original 13 colonies. As more American settlers wished to move to the Great Plains, the American government started creating new, more restrictive treaties and forced them onto the Native Americans. These new, more restrictive treaties resulted in violence erupting between the Native Americans and American settlers. In 1864, a militia colonel named John Chivington attacked a camp of Cheyenne Indians, killing 200 Indians, mostly women and children, in what is now known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Meanwhile, the Sioux chief, Red Cloud, protested American settlers moving to the Black Hills, an area sacred to his people, and fought against both American settlers and the American Army. Chief Red Cloud and many other Sioux leaders would come to accept treaties with the American government and begin living on designated reservations, but many other Native Americans refused to give up their lands, and conflict between Native Americans and American settlers would continue sporadically. The violence would increase dramatically when Colonel George Armstrong Custer reported that the Black Hills contained gold in 1874. This report would cause a new gold rush, with American miners moving to settle the land while the government offered to buy the land. The Sioux rejected the settlers' claims and refused to sell their land to the American government. In response, the American Army was deployed to force the Sioux to negotiate. This army, under the command of General Custer, was defeated and wiped out in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Within months of this defeat, a second American army arrived and defeated the Sioux. To bring about peace, the Dawes Act of 1887 tried to promote the Native Americans' assimilation of white culture. The Dawes Act wanted to dismantle the reservation policy put in place and grant lots of land to the head of each Native American household. The Dawes Act was unsuccessful as the Native Americans were given poor farming and grazing land and would have lost all rights to gold and silver deposit. Another devastating blow to the Plains Indians was the Massacre of the Buffalo, which once freely roamed the Great Plains. Without the buffalo, many clans faced severe handicaps in their daily life. In the 1880s, the trials of the Sioux clans continued to grow. Many of the Sioux attempted a ritual called the Ghost Dance to bring back the buffalo and replenish their lands. The ritual was unsuccessful, and many of the Sioux began moving to allotted reservations. In 1890, miscommunication between the U.S. Army and the Sioux would result in the Battle of Wounded Knee. Over 300 Sioux, many unarmed, and 25 American soldiers were killed. America's impact on the Western frontier. With the arrival of new settlers, new animals were introduced to the Great Plains. Cattle herds soon replaced the buffalo herds of the American Indians. The Spanish began building ranches of longhorn cattle, which would expand to Texas. Native Americans were the first cowboy, often forced into the role as captives of the Spanish. The Spanish created many features of cowboy cultures, and words such as corral and rodeo come from the Spanish language. Cattle became the primary herd of the Great Plains, quickly eclipsing the dwindling buffalo. After the Civil War, demand for beef increased greatly in the growing populations of eastern cities. Ranch owners began to relocate their cattle to Chicago. Cowboys would herd tens of thousands of cattle on the Chisholm Trail from Texas to Kansas to ship east. Abilene, Kansas became a major shipping location due to the demand of beef. This demand meant that more than 50,000 cowboys herded cattle over the next 2 decades. About a quarter were African Americans and about 12% Mexican. Cowboys worked around 12 to 14 hours a day and were forced to work in all kinds of weather. In the spring, the cowboys traveled across vast ranges to collect cattle and prepare them for the trip north. Cowboys would mark or brand new calves with the ranch's symbol to declare ownership of the animal before herding thousands of animals on the long drive to Kansas. This process would take about 3 months of hard work on the unforgiving plains, but a successful herding would result in profit for both the cowboys and farmers. When the cowboys and herd finally reached their destination, the cattle would be sold off and the cowboys could finally relax. The profitable life of cowboys soon created many problems. To maximize profits, herds grew too large and the cattle overgrazed the land. Bad weather plagued the cowboys, as extreme heat and cold killed much of the herds. In 1887, a massive blizzard struck the Great Plains, and many ranchers lost their herds. Due to disputes over cattle and land ownership, most ranchers began to fence their herds in using barbed wire. New breeds of cattle were introduced in hopes of better adapting to the land and climate, and the ranchers' dependence on longhorn cattle ended. With the new breeds of cattle and now fenced-in land, the era of open-range cattle and mass cattle drives ended. The growth of the railroad. To promote growth of the United States and aid settlers in moving west, a vast railroad was built that crossed the continent. From 1850 to 1871, the American government gave railroad companies choice land to aid the building of the railroads. In 1867, the Central Pacific Company began building the railroad starting east from Sacramento and the Union Pacific west from Omaha. To build the roads at a profit, construction companies hired immigrants to perform the hard labor at low costs. Despite the terrible working conditions, Irish and Chinese immigrants, along with African and Mexican Americans, would flood hiring offices. These workers were responsible for performing the most terrible of jobs, and finally in 1869, the two routes met in Utah and completed the first transcontinental train track. The railroad companies would turn around and sell some of the land granted to them to farmers. The governor of Kansas, desiring a growth in population, invited African Americans to settle Kansas, which brought many new settlers. The federal government offered cheap land to farmers, herders, and settlers, and in one day in 1889, 2 million acres were claimed in Oklahoma. The land was sold cheaply due to the extreme hardships many of the settlers would endure, and life was rarely easy. The home life of the American frontiersman. Despite the dangers and troubles of frontier life from 1850 to 1900, the amount of people living west of the Mississippi rose from 1 to almost 30%. Settlers would adapt to their land, and where trees were lacking, homes were often built into hills or out of sod. The settlers owned vast amounts of land and were often living in near isolation from even their neighbors. Women worked in the fields alongside men, as well as raising the children, running the house, and doing the cooking and laundry. The frontier farmer brought a steel plow to break the prairie's tough soil and relied on numerous machines to harvest their wheat. The federal government would give land to the states to create agricultural colleges. These agricultural colleges were used to introduce new crops and farming techniques to the settlers, and because of these efforts, the eastern Great Plains were very productive. Despite aid from state and federal government, the frontier farmer still faced numerous difficulties. Bad storms plagued the region, and the fiercer storms could destroy an entire season of crops. Another problem facing frontier farmers was being in financial debt. The various farming machines cost money to be purchased and maintained, which many farmers had to borrow to set up their farms. When grain harvests were destroyed by storms or prices for grain fell, farmers were unable to repay the money they borrowed. Farmers were unhappy with the shipping rates they were charged by the railroads, but were dependent on them to transport their crops. Farmers were challenged by ever-changing economic conditions. After the Civil War, the supply of paper money shrank, making each dollar in circulation worth more. The rarity of paper dollars hurt farmers who had to repay their loan in more expensive dollars. Farmers urged policies that would promote cheap money, and they wanted more money printed or the amount of the silver coins to be increased. Frontier farmers created organizations to promote their causes, one such being the Grange, which pushed for laws to regulate railroads. The Farmers Alliance sent public speakers to farm communities and tried to create support for cheap money, railroad reform, and other political agendas. The Southern Alliance and the Colored Farmers National Alliance group were created and pursued similar campaigns in the region. How politics impacted Western expansion. The various farmers' movements resulted in the creation of the Populist or People's Party in 1891. The Populist Party demanded policies to help struggling farmers, democratic reforms such as the direct election of senators, and secret ballots for voting. The Populist Party collected 10% of the vote in 1892 presidential election and won many local elections. However, the economy faltered again, and a business panic in 1893 started a depression. As the economy continued to struggle, the Democrats supported William Jennings Bryan for president in 1896. William Bryan campaigned for cheap money by urging that the nation's currency be backed by plentiful silver as well as gold. The Populists nominated Bryan as well as he supported many of their goals. Urban voters feared that cheap money would create a spike in prices and supported William McKinley, a Republican. William McKinley would go on to win the election over Bryan, and with his defeat, the populist movement died. Fun fact: President McKinley would be fatally shot on September 6, 1901, passing away September 14th. After Leon Frank Zaltzis shot McKinley, the crowd subdued him and began to beat him severely. The wounded McKinley shouted, "Boys, don't let them hurt him." These words would save Zaltzis' life, and he stood trial and was executed for the assassination of President McKinley. An item of interest during the Western expansion of the United States was government's actions to preserve some of the western wilderness. In 1872, the federal government set land aside to create Yellowstone National Park. The federal government would continue to set aside millions of acres of land in an effort to save land for future generations. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.